Let's work on Chapter 4, Problem 31, where we're going to calculate the standard deviation for a series of numbers and see how the standard deviation changes when we add, subtract, multiply, or divide that series of numbers. So it's like the one we did for number 17, but we're using the standard deviation. Now, in fact, it's the same data, so I'm going to go back to 417 and click on that tab, and I'm going to copy our table because it's going to be the same data, except instead of the average, we're going to want the standard deviation. So I do Control Copy, click back to tab 431, I'll paste it here, and there we have. Now, the same data, we've got the constant, 2 added to the constant, 2 subtracted from the constant, 2 times the constant, and half the constant. And instead, we're going to want the standard deviation. So I'll change this to standard deviation. And now we need to, since these were created with auto sum, we've got this down arrow here, and we can choose whatever we want that final column to be. And this time we want it to be standard deviation. Then we choose standard deviation. And there we've got a standard deviation of 2.12 and the constant. Now what happens when we add the 2 to each number? I go and change this to standard deviation. And look, the standard deviation is exactly the same. Even though we moved the mean over 2 places, the shape of the curve didn't change. It didn't get fatter, it didn't get narrower. The standard deviation is still 2. And now how about if we subtract 2 from it? The standard deviation is still 2.12. We can move it down lower, but the shape of the curve, which is defined by the standard deviation, doesn't change. The position changes, but the shape doesn't. Ooh, now what happens if we multiply each number by 2? Let's check to see what the standard deviation is now. Down arrow, standard deviation. Aha, the standard deviation has gotten bigger because the numbers were higher, kept the same distribution, so it got wider to keep the same shape. Well, let's summarize here. So A and B would be that adding or subtracting a number or a constant to a series of numbers does not change the standard deviation. Well, let's just call it SD. That's the APA abbreviation for standard deviation. So C would be multiplying a series of numbers by a constant multiplies the standard deviation by the same constant. Now what's going to happen in D where we divide? Let's change this from average to standard deviation. 1.06, so that's half of the standard deviation. So we can say, let's go up here to finish this D. Dividing a series of numbers by a constant divides the standard deviation by the same constant. So adding and subtracting doesn't change the standard deviation, but multiplying the numbers, making the curve twice as tall or half as tall, will change the standard deviation by that same factor.